The clock on Taewoo's computer screen showed 2:17 a.m. when the entire research station shook like an earthquake had hit. Books tumbled from shelves, his half-empty coffee mug crashed to the floor, and the lights flickered before the emergency. Power kicked in. But this wasn't any earthquake he'd ever felt before. Taewoo pushed back from his desk, heart hammering against his ribs. He'd been alone at the mountain research facility for 3 weeks now, studying soil samples and writing his thesis on extremophile bacteria. The nearest town was 40 miles away, and his cell phone had no signal up here. Whatever had just happened, he was completely on his own. Through the window, he could see an orange glow flickering between the pine trees about 200 yards from the station. Something was burning out there, and it definitely hadn't been there when he'd made his evening rounds. The rational part of his brain told him to stay inside, lock the doors, and wait until morning. But Taewoo had never been good at following the rational part of his brain. He grabbed his emergency kit, a flashlight, and his grandfather's old hunting knife from the drawer. The mountain air bit through his thin sweater as he stepped outside, and the smell hit him immediately. It wasn't wood smoke or gasoline or anything else he recognized. It was sharp and metallic, like copper pennies mixed with ozone after a lightning strike. The crater was the first thing that didn't make sense. It was perfectly round, about 15 feet across, and the earth inside looked like it had been melted rather than exploded. The trees around it were bent outward in a perfect circle, their bark blackened but not burned. And in the center of it all lay something that made Taewoo's knees go weak. At first, his brain tried to make it into something familiar. A bear, maybe, or some kind of large machinery. But as he got closer, the flashlight beam revealed details that belonged in his worst nightmares. The thing was huge, easily 8 feet long and almost as wide. Its body was covered in what looked like natural armor plating, dark blue-black and segmented like a beetle's shell. 6 limbs were folded beneath it, each ending in appendages that could have been hands or claws depending on how you looked at them. But it was the wounds that made Taewoo forget his terror and remember his training. Deep gashes carved across the creature's torso, edges cauterized and weeping a fluid that glowed faintly blue in the darkness. These weren't natural injuries. Something had done this deliberately, with weapons that burned as they cut. The creature's breathing was shallow and irregular. Each exhale produced a whistling sound that spoke of internal damage. Whatever this thing was, wherever it had come from, it was dying. Taewoo had always been the kid who brought home injured birds, who cried when his parents had to put down their old dog, who'd chosen xenobiology because he wanted to understand life in all its forms. Looking at this impossible being, those same instincts kicked in stronger than his fear. He knelt beside the creature's head, noting the way its skull was elongated and ridged, built for a brain much larger than any earth animal. 2 eyes, each, the size of his fist, were closed beneath translucent lids. But as his flashlight beam swept across them, the lids fluttered open. The eyes that looked back at him were nothing like any animal he'd ever seen. They were deep amber, flecked with gold and absolutely unmistakably intelligent. Not the simple awareness of a dog or the clever problem-solving of a dolphin, but the complex reasoning intelligence of a sentient being. This creature was looking at him and thinking about what it saw. More than that, there was something in those eyes that Taewoo recognized from his own mirror on bad days. Fear, yes, but also resignation. The creature expected to die here, alone on an alien world, and it had made peace with that fact. "Hey there," Taewoo whispered, his voice shaking. "I know you probably can't understand me, but I'm not going to hurt you." The creature's eyes tracked his movements as he opened his emergency kit. The supplies inside seemed laughably inadequate. Bandages, antiseptic, pain medication meant for humans. How do you treat wounds on an alien being whose biology you don't understand? But he had to try. The alternative was watching this magnificent creature die while he did nothing, and that wasn't something Taewoo could live with. As he began cleaning the smallest wound with careful, gentle movements, he could swear he felt the creature relax slightly. Those intelligent eyes never left his face, studying him with the same intensity that he was studying it. And for just a moment, Tae-woo had the strangest feeling that it understood exactly what he was trying to do. This was going to change everything. The third day, Tae-woo had fallen into a routine that would have seemed impossible a week ago. Every morning, he'd wake up on the uncomfortable cot he'd dragged into the main lab, check on his patient, and then spend the next several hours playing amateur alien veterinarian. The creature had been too weak to move much at first, which made treatment easier but also more terrifying. Tae-woo had no idea if he was helping or slowly poisoning it with human medications. All he could do was clean the wounds, apply fresh bandages, and hope that basic medical principles worked the same way across species. On the second day, he'd tried offering it water. The creature had lifted its massive head with obvious effort and lapped at the bowl with a tongue that was surprisingly similar to a cat's, just much larger. That small success had felt like winning the lottery. By day 3, it was strong enough to sit up partially, propping itself against the lab wall. With 2 of its 6 limbs, Tae-woo had started talking to it while he worked, partly to calm his own nerves and partly because those intelligent eyes seemed to follow every word he said. "I called in sick to my advisor again," he was saying as he changed the bandage on the creature's largest wound. "Professor Park is going to start asking questions soon. I can only claim food poisoning for so long before he drives up here to check on me." The creature made a sound somewhere between a purr and a rumble. It had been doing that more often, especially when Tae-woo talked in a calm, gentle voice. He was starting to think it might be a sign of contentment or gratitude. "The good news is your wounds are healing faster than anything I've ever seen," Tae-woo continued, examining the edges of the injury. Where there had been raw, burned flesh 3 days ago, new tissue was already forming. The blue fluid had stopped seeping, and the angry red inflammation was fading to a healthier color. As he reached for fresh gauze, something extraordinary happened. The world around him suddenly filled with images that weren't his own, stars wheeling in patterns he didn't recognize. Ships the size of cities floating in the void between worlds. Massive battles fought with weapons that turned entire planets to glass. And through it all, a sense of desperate flight, of running from something too terrible to face. Tae-woo jerked backward, dropping the bandages. The visions faded as quickly as they'd come, leaving him gasping and disoriented. The creature was watching him intently, its amber eyes somehow brighter than before. "What just happened?" Tae-woo whispered. More images flooded his mind, gentler this time. A name, or something like a name, formed in his thoughts. Not sounds or letters, but a concept that felt like the rumble of distant thunder mixed with the crash of ocean waves. The closest he could come to pronouncing it was Vorthuk. "Vorthuk," he said aloud, and the creature's eyes seemed to brighten further. Over the next few hours, the mental communication became easier. Not words exactly, but shared emotions and pictures that conveyed meaning better than any language. Tae-woo learned that Vorthuk came from a world where massive creatures like himself lived in harmony with technology that seemed like magic. They were explorers and warriors, protectors of smaller species who couldn't defend themselves. But something had gone wrong. A faction called the Hegemony had risen to power, conquering world after world with ruthless efficiency. They showed no mercy to those who opposed them, and no kindness to those who surrendered. Vorthuk's people had fought them for decades before, finally being forced to flee their dying homeworld. Vorthuk had been a scout, searching for new planets where his people could settle in peace. But the Hegemony had found him, attacked his ship, and chased him across half the galaxy before finally shooting him down over this small blue world that barely registered on their star charts. The most remarkable thing wasn't the story itself, but the way Vorthuk seemed genuinely amazed by Tae-woo's reaction to it. Through their mental link, Tae-woo could feel the alien's confusion at being helped by a stranger. On most worlds, apparently, beings like Tae-woo would have either run in terror or tried to capture him for study. "Where I come from," Tae-woo explained, trying to project the thought as clearly as possible, "we have a saying, when you save someone's life, you become responsible for them. But I think it works both ways. You've become my responsibility, and I've become yours." The concept seemed to resonate with Vorthuk in a way that surprised them both. His people had a similar tradition, but they'd never applied it across species before. The idea that a small, fragile being like Tae-woo would risk himself for something he didn't understand challenged everything Vorthak thought he knew about the universe. As the days passed, their communication became more sophisticated. Vorthak shared knowledge of the galaxy, of countless worlds and species, of technologies that could heal wounds in minutes or cross vast distances in the blink of an eye. In return, Tae-woo shared human concepts that fascinated the alien warrior. Compassion without expectation of reward. Scientific curiosity that drove beings to risk everything for knowledge. The strange human habit of adopting members of other species as family. But it was on the 7th day that their peaceful routine was shattered forever. Tae-woo was making breakfast when the first blast shattered his peaceful morning. He'd been scrambling eggs, humming an old song his grandmother used to sing when the entire kitchen window exploded inward in a shower of glass and superheated air. The force of the explosion threw him backward against the refrigerator, his ears ringing, and vision blurred. Smoke poured through the ruined window, carrying that same metallic smell he'd first noticed a week ago. But this time it was mixed with something else. Something that made his primitive brain scream warnings about predators and death. From the main lab came a sound Tae-woo had never heard before. Vorthak was making a noise somewhere between a roar and a battle cry, filled with rage and defiance. But underneath it, Tae-woo could hear something that chilled him to the bone. Fear. Not for himself, but for the small human who had become his unlikely friend. Tae-woo crawled toward the lab on hands and knees, staying low as more energy blasts tore through the research station's walls. Through the doorway, he could see Vorthak struggling to stand, his massive frame still weakened from his injuries but determined to fight anyway. Stay down. Vorthak's voice echoed in Tae-woo's mind, urgent and desperate. Hegemony hunters, they found me. Through the mental link, images flashed between them, sleek predatory shapes moving with deadly precision through the forest outside, smaller than Vorthak but built for killing, with elongated limbs and armor that shifted color to match their surroundings. They carried weapons that could burn through steel like paper, and they showed no mercy to anything that stood in their way. How many? Tae-woo whispered, pressing himself against the wall as another blast carved a smoking hole through the ceiling above his head. 5, came the reply. Maybe 6. They hunt in packs. The next explosion took out the front wall of the station entirely. Through the gaping hole, Tae-woo got his first clear look at humanity's newest nightmare. The creatures moved like liquid death, flowing from cover to cover with impossible grace. Their heads were narrow and predatory, with too many eyes that glowed like hot coals in the morning shadows. When they opened their mouths to communicate with each other, Tae-woo could see rows of razor-sharp teeth designed for tearing flesh. One of them spotted him through the destroyed wall and raised its weapon. The barrel began to glow with the same sickly energy that had nearly killed Vorthak a week ago. But before it could fire, 8 feet of wounded alien warrior crashed through the lab's rear wall like a living battering ram. Vorthak had circled around the building, using his knowledge of human architecture and Tae-woo's mental map of the station to launch a surprise attack. The hunter barely had time to turn before Vorthak's massive fist connected with its elongated skull. The sound was like a watermelon hitting concrete, wet and final. The creature's weapon spun away into the forest as its body crumpled to the ground, but the victory cost them. The other hunters immediately focused their fire on Vorthak, forcing him to take cover behind the station's concrete foundation. Energy blasts chewed chunks out of his makeshift shelter, and Tae-woo could see fresh wounds opening along his friend's armored hide. "We have to run," Vorthak projected, his mental voice strained with pain and effort. "I can't fight them all. Not like this." Tae-woo's mind raced. The hunters had them pinned down, and it was only a matter of minutes before they worked around to flank them. The nearest help was 40 miles away, and his cell phone was still useless up here in the mountains. Even if he could call for help, what would he say? That aliens were trying to kill him? They'd think he'd lost his mind. But as he watched another energy blast nearly take Vorthak's head off, something clicked in Tae-woo's brain. These hunters might be advanced, but they were also arrogant. They'd tracked their prey across the galaxy, expecting to find him alone and helpless on a primitive world. They weren't prepared for resistance, especially not from the local wildlife. "I have an idea," Taewoo said, already moving toward his emergency supplies. "But you have to trust me." "Little friend," Vorthak replied, and even through the alien, mental link, Taewoo could hear the affection in that term. "I trusted you when I was dying. I trust you now." Taewoo grabbed his backpack and started stuffing it with everything that might be useful. His camping gear, the first aid kit, a few energy bars, and most importantly, the emergency flares he kept for signaling rescue helicopters. The hunters might have superior technology, but they'd never dealt with human desperation mixed with a graduate student's knowledge of chemistry and physics. As another blast shook the building, Taewoo felt something he'd never experienced before. Not just fear for his own life, but rage at these creatures who had come to his world to hurt his friend. They wanted a fight. They were about to learn why humans had conquered their own planet despite being small, weak, and seemingly helpless. "Follow me," he told Vorthak, "and stay close. We're going to show them what happens when you threaten a human's family." Running through the forest with a wounded 8-foot alien warrior was not something Taewoo had ever imagined doing, but here he was dodging energy blasts while his brain worked overtime to figure out how two completely outgunned beings could possibly survive the next hour. The hunters were right behind them, their weapons lighting up the morning forest with deadly flashes of energy. Trees exploded into splinters and flames wherever the shots landed, filling the air with smoke and the smell of burning pine. Taewoo's lungs burned as he pushed himself harder than he'd ever run before. But Vorthak was struggling more. His wounds had reopened during the fight, leaving a trail that their pursuers could follow even without their advanced tracking technology. "This way," Taewoo gasped, veering toward a rocky outcrop he remembered from his geological surveys. Behind, the rocks was a narrow cave system that went deeper into the mountain than he'd ever explored. If they could reach it, maybe the hunters' weapons would be less effective in the confined space. They made it to the rocks just as another energy blast carved a smoking crater in the ground where Taewoo had been standing seconds before. The cave entrance was barely wide enough for Vorthak to squeeze through, but once inside they found themselves in a larger chamber that stretched back into darkness. "They'll follow us in here," Vorthak projected, his mental voice tight with pain. "Cornered prey is still prey." "Maybe," Taewoo said, dropping his backpack and pulling out his emergency supplies. "But down here, their advantages don't mean as much. And I know these caves better than they do." Over the next few minutes, while the hunters regrouped outside, Taewoo worked with the focused intensity of someone whose life depended on getting the details right. He used his emergency flares to create crude but effective explosive devices, rigging them to pressure plates made from his camping equipment. The chemistry was basic, but the physics were sound. When the hunters came through that narrow entrance, they'd get a surprise that no amount of advanced technology could protect them from. But Taewoo's real stroke of genius came from something Vorthak had shared during their mental conversations. The hunters relied heavily on their thermal vision and electromagnetic sensors to track prey in low-light conditions. What they couldn't see was the underground stream that ran through this part of the cave system, carrying mineral-rich water that would interfere with their equipment. "Your people," Taewoo said as he rigged the last of his makeshift traps. "They're warriors, right? They understand tactics and strategy?" "We are," Vorthak replied, watching his small friend work with growing amazement. "But we fight with honor. Direct confrontation. These hunters, they are different. They use deception and overwhelming force." "Good," Taewoo said grimly, "because I'm about to show them what happens when you bring overwhelming force to a fight against human creativity." The first hunter entered the cave exactly as Taewoo had predicted, moving with predatory confidence into what it thought was a simple trap. The explosion that followed was modest by alien weapon standards, but in the confined space of the cave, it was devastating. The hunter's scream echoed off the stone walls as it was thrown backward into its companions, but Taewoo wasn't done. As the remaining hunters hesitated at the entrance, he activated his second surprise. Using his knowledge of the cave's acoustics and a trick he'd learned from studying bat echolocation, he created a series of sound pulses that completely overwhelmed the hunters' sensitive hearing. They stumbled forward, disoriented and partially deaf, right into Vorthak's waiting arms. What followed wasn't really a fight. It was a demonstration of what happened when alien warrior training met human tactical thinking. Vorthak knew exactly where to strike to disable rather than kill, while Taewoo used his understanding of physics to turn the cave itself into a weapon. Loose rocks became projectiles, water became a conductor for improvised electrical traps, and shadows became allies that hid their movements from the hunter's compromised sensors. The last hunter fell when Taewoo used his camping mirror to reflect the creature's own weapon blast back at it, a trick that would have been impossible in open terrain but worked perfectly in the cave's crystalline formations. As silence fell over the underground chamber, Taewoo found himself sitting on a rock, shaking from adrenaline and the realization of what they'd just accomplished. 5 advanced alien warriors armed with weapons that could level buildings had been defeated by a graduate student with camping gear and a wounded refugee who'd learned to trust human ingenuity. "Your species," Vorthak said, settling down beside him with obvious relief, "thinks in ways that confuse even experienced warriors. You see opportunities where others see only obstacles. You make weapons from tools, and tools from anything around you." "We have to," Taewoo replied simply. "We're not the biggest or strongest or fastest species on our own planet, but we're stubborn, and we don't give up when things get difficult. And we definitely don't abandon our friends." Through their mental link, he could feel Vorthak's amazement at that concept. In the aliens' culture, warriors fought alongside those they'd trained with for years. The idea that a being would risk everything for someone they'd known for barely a week challenged everything he thought he understood about survival and loyalty. But as they sat together in the darkness, both wounded but alive, Vorthak began to understand something that would change how his people viewed the small blue planet they'd accidentally discovered. Humans weren't just another species to be catalogued and forgotten. They were something the galaxy had never seen before. The morning sun was just breaking over the mountain peaks when Taewoo heard the helicopters approaching. He and Vorthak had spent the night in the cave, both too exhausted to move and too wired from adrenaline to sleep. The sound of rotors cutting through the thin mountain air sent a spike of panic through his chest. "Government," he muttered, peering out through the cave entrance. Someone must have seen the explosions or detected the energy signatures from those weapons. Through their mental link, he could feel Vorthak's resignation. After everything they'd been through together, after surviving impossible odds and forging a friendship that crossed the boundaries of species, it was going to end with his alien friend being dragged away to some secret laboratory. "I won't let them take you," Taewoo said firmly. But even as he spoke the words, he knew how powerless he was against military helicopters and government agents. Vorthak's response surprised him. Instead of despair or anger, the alien warrior projected something that felt almost like amusement. "Look up, little friend. Look at the sky." Taewoo tilted his head back and saw them. Ships hanging in the morning air like impossible miracles, their hulls gleaming silver blue in the sunlight. They were nothing like the hunters' vessels, which had been built for stealth and killing. These ships felt different somehow, radiating a sense of ancient wisdom and peaceful strength. "My people," Vorthak explained, struggling to his feet despite his wounds. "They've been searching for me. The distress beacon in my ship finally reached them. The government helicopters had apparently seen the alien vessels too, because they were now circling at a safe distance, their pilots probably radioing frantically for instructions on how to handle first contact with an extraterrestrial civilization. But what happened next changed everything Taewoo thought he knew about how these situations were supposed to work. Instead of landing to retrieve Vorthak, the alien ship settled into a defensive formation around the mountain. A single smaller craft descended toward the cave where Taewoo and his friend waited. As it touched down, a ramp extended, and 3 beings emerged who looked similar to Vorthak, but were clearly different individuals. The largest of them, a female whose armor bore intricate markings that spoke of high rank, approached the cave entrance with cautious respect. When she spoke, Tae-woo was amazed to hear her words translated into perfect Korean inside his head. "I am Commander Kesara," she said, her mental voice carrying tones of authority and curiosity. "I have come to retrieve our lost scout and to understand how he survived in a place where he should have died alone." What followed was the strangest conversation of Tae-woo's life. Through Vorthak's mental translation, he found himself explaining to an alien military commander how he'd discovered a crashed warrior, treated his wounds with human medicine, and then fought off a squad of hegemony hunters using camping supplies and cave acoustics. Commander Kesara listened with growing amazement, occasionally asking questions that revealed just how unprecedented Tae-woo's actions were in her experience. Most species, when encountering something like Vorthak, would have either fled in terror or captured him for study. The idea that a being would risk everything to help a complete stranger, expecting nothing in return, was almost incomprehensible to her. "Your species," she finally said, "has been observed by our scouts for some time. We knew humans were unusual, but we did not understand how unusual until now." She went on to explain that humanity had caught the attention of several galactic civilizations, not because of their technology or military power, but because of their unique approach to problem-solving and their seemingly irrational willingness to help others. While most species in the galaxy formed alliances based on mutual benefit or fear, humans appeared to operate on principles that confused even the most advanced civilizations. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of government officials who had apparently worked up the courage to approach the alien landing site. What followed was humanity's first official diplomatic contact with an extraterrestrial civilization, and Tae-woo found himself thrust into the role of translator and cultural ambassador. But the most remarkable moment came when Commander Kesara made an announcement that would change both worlds forever. Her people, she explained, were part of a loose confederation of species that opposed the hegemony's expansion across the galaxy. They had been fighting a losing war for decades, slowly, being pushed back by an enemy that showed no mercy and accepted no surrender. What they needed wasn't more warriors or better weapons. They needed something the galaxy had never seen before. Allies who could think in completely new ways, who could find solutions that traditional military thinking couldn't imagine. "We offer partnership," Commander Kesara said, addressing both Tae-woo and the human officials who had gathered around them. "Not conquest, not subjugation, but true alliance between equals. Your species has something precious that we have lost in our long wars. You still believe that enemies can become friends, that strangers can become family, that hope can triumph over fear." As Tae-woo looked around at the scene, alien ships and human helicopters sharing the same sky, he realized that his simple decision to help a wounded stranger had opened a door that could never be closed. Humanity was no longer alone in the universe, and the galaxy would never be the same. Standing beside Vorthak, feeling the warmth of genuine friendship flowing through their mental connection, Tae-woo smiled. Sometimes the greatest adventures began with the smallest acts of kindness. The stars were calling, and humanity was finally ready to answer.